Hello everyone, and welcome back to the channel. Today we're going to continue our exploration of Indian mysticism and philosophy by exploring the profound and fascinating spiritual tradition of Kashmir Shaivism. Now, when you hear the name Kashmir Shaivism, two things might stand out immediately. The first is Shaivism, meaning the worship and philosophy centered on Shiva, one of the most important and ancient deities of the Hindu tradition. The second is Kashmir, the beautiful region in northern India, which for many centuries was not only a crossroads of cultures, but also a center of profound philosophical creativity and spiritual innovation. Although most of the population of Kashmir today is Muslim, before the arrival of Islam in the 13th century, Kashmir had a reputation as one of the great centers of learning in the Indian world, home to both Buddhists and Hindus. It was here, between roughly the 9th and 11th centuries, that a particularly rich form of Shaiva philosophy and practice emerged, which we now today call Kashmir Shaivism. It is important to note, however, that Kashmir Shaivism is not simply a regional curiosity. It represents one of the most sophisticated expressions of Indian thought, a philosophy that engages directly with Vedanta, with Buddhism, and with rival Shaiva schools, while developing its own integrated vision of consciousness, reality, and liberation. Kashmir Shaivism also forms part of the wider tradition of Tantra. Now, Tantra is one of those words that often causes great confusion in the modern West, if not in India itself today. It conjures up all sorts of popular associations, often narrowed down to ideas about sexuality or esoteric ritual. But in its Indian context, Tantra is a broad and complex set of very diverse religious traditions, texts, and practices which emphasize ritual, mantras, visualization, yogic discipline, and above all the transformation of ordinary life into a direct experience of the divine. Kashmir Shaivism forms part of what we call the right hand as opposed to the left hand path in Tantra. To find out more about Tantra in general, and more specifically the difference between the so-called left and right hand paths, check out my other video on left hand Tantra. Now, the Shaiva Agamas, a series of texts, provide the scriptural foundation of Kashmir Shaivism. But what distinguishes this tradition is that while it inherits the ritual richness of Tantra, its philosophical focus is on knowledge and recognition. Liberation is not just about performing rituals correctly or mechanically, it is about a very real, profound shift in awareness, a recovery of one's true identity as divine consciousness itself. The system of Kashmir Shaivism took shape under a series of quite remarkable and highly original thinkers. Somananda in the 10th century developed what became known as the Prajnabinya school, the philosophy of recognition. His central claim was one of absolute idealism, that nothing can exist independently of consciousness. What we call external objects, he argued, ultimately exist only as expressions within consciousness. His student Utpaladeva wrote the stanzas on the recognition of God, where he explained that liberation is achieved through the recognition that one's deepest self is none other than Shiva, universal consciousness itself. And then in the late 10th and early 11th centuries came Abhinavagupta, perhaps the greatest philosopher, mystic, that India ever produced. He's not as well known as others, partly the reason being that not all of his texts have been translated into English, or they've only recently been translated. So despite the contributions he made to Indian thought, he's not as well known in the West. However, Abhinavagupta not only systematized the philosophy of his predecessors, but integrated it with ritual, aesthetics, and practice. In so doing, he presented an all-encompassing vision of reality in which every aspect of experience, from meditation to art to ordinary life, could become a doorway into divine awareness. One sees here the tantric element of Kashmir Shaivism insofar as it is very much a path for householders. This is not a path for reclusive monks who go into their caves and renounce the world. This is very much a path to be followed by everyday people immersed in the here and now of the world. So what is the core teaching of Kashmir Shaivism? What is this tradition all about? At its heart lies a simple but radical claim. Consciousness is the fundamental nature of reality. Not matter, not atoms, not a formless void as the Buddhists appear to argue, but consciousness itself. Everything we perceive, everything that exists, is a manifestation of a single, universal, dynamic consciousness that is identified with Shiva. Now, why might this be a compelling answer? Well, think about it. Whatever you propose as the ultimate reality, whether you say it's matter, energy, or even emptiness, you can only say that because you are conscious. In other words, every claim presupposes consciousness. Consciousness is the precondition of any possible experience. So, Kashmir Shaivism asks, why not recognize consciousness as the very ground of being itself? In this view of things, consciousness and being become synonyms. It's important to note, however, that the consciousness of which Kashmir Shaivism speaks is not a passive or abstract consciousness. Unlike in Advaita Vedanta, where Brahman is often described as a static, featureless absolute, in Kashmir Shaivism, consciousness is inherently dynamic. It is full of power, freedom, and creativity, which is referred to as Leela, or the divine play or dance of Shiva. This dynamism or dance is expressed through two technical concepts, prakasha and vimarsha. Prakasha means light, the illuminating quality of consciousness that reveals everything. Vimarsha means self-reflection or reflexive awareness, the I or the subject that not only knows, but knows that it knows. Together, these two principles are inseparable. Consciousness is light, and it is also self-aware. In symbolic terms, Prakasha is identified with Shiva and Vimarsha with Shakti, the divine energy. So, why are both needed? Well, imagine if consciousness were only Prakasha, only pure light. Then reality would shine, as it were, but without anyone there to notice it. Things would appear, but there would be no recognition of them. It would be like a universe flooded with light, but with no subject to perceive it, or like a torchlight shining light, but no one there to see it. On the other hand, equally, if consciousness were only vimarsha, only self-reflection, it would be locked in pure subjectivity, endlessly aware of itself, but without the power to manifest or reveal anything beyond. For Kashmir Shaivism, it is precisely the union of the two, light and self-awareness, Shiva and Shakti, that makes consciousness both luminous and free, both knowing and creative. This interplay is the source of the world itself. The universe is not an illusion, as it is in Advaita Vedanta and certain traditions of Buddhism, nor is it inert matter, as it is according to the materialists. It is instead the free self-expression of a consciousness that both shines and knows it shines. Within the broad framework of Kashmir Shaivism, two philosophical schools stand out. The first is the philosophy of recognition. According to the thinker Utpaladeva and Abhinavagupta, bondage arises because we have forgotten our true nature. We mistake ourselves for limited, isolated individuals, struggling in an apparently hostile world. Liberation, then, is not about becoming something new, but about recognizing or recognizing what was always already the case, that our authentic identity is universal consciousness, Shiva himself. I think there are some interesting parallels here to the philosophy of Zen Buddhism, and I would encourage viewers to check out my video on that topic to find out more. Admittedly, Zen wouldn't use this language of universal consciousness or Shiva or the divine. However, I suspect that it's gesturing towards the same fundamental idea. The second key philosophical school in Kashmir Shaivism is the doctrine of vibration or spanda. Here the emphasis is on the direct experience of consciousness as pulsation, vibration, or movement. Every perception, every thought, every sensation is really the movement of consciousness or the universal rhythm of Shiva. By attuning ourselves to this pulsation, we come to see that all of life is an expression of divine vibration. Both of these teachings converge on the same insight. Enlightenment is not the rejection of the world, but its transfiguration. The realization that everything, down to the smallest detail of experience, is none other than consciousness manifesting itself. There's an interesting link here with the philosophy and tradition of German idealism. Indeed, I'd argue Kashmir Shaivism bears striking resemblances to certain strands of this philosophy in the late 18th and early 19th centuries. Indeed, thinkers like Fichte, Schelling, and of course Hegel also grappled with the problem of how consciousness relates to the world, and many came to a position remarkably close to the Shaiva one, that reality is, in some sense, the unfolding of an absolute consciousness or spirit. Just as Abhinavagupta insisted that both subject and object are expressions of one dynamic awareness, the German philosopher Hegel famously described reality as the self-unfolding of Geist or spirit through stages of self-recognition. Similarly, Schelling's philosophy of identity saw nature and mind as two aspects of the same absolute. Now, these parallels don't mean that Kashmir Shaivism and German idealism are identical. They arose in very different historical contexts and therefore come with quite different vocabularies. But both traditions, I would argue, converge on the bold intuition that the ultimate ground of reality is consciousness itself, not passive, but self-revealing, self-reflective, and creative. In Kashmir Shaivism, this leads us to what is sometimes called the integral monism of the tradition. Unlike its rival, Advaita Vedanta, which tends to regard the world as an illusion, a mere projection upon Brahman, the Shaivites instead argue that the world is very much real. It is not separate from consciousness, but an authentic expression of it. This speaks to the life-affirming tradition of Kashmir Shaivism and of Tantra more generally. In this view of things, both the finite and the infinite, the subject and the object, unity and diversity, all are aspects of one and the same reality. Ignorance, from this point of view, is simply the failure to see the intimate connection between the finite and the infinite. Liberation is not freedom from the world, but freedom to participate in it fully, knowing it as the play of divine consciousness. You can see here how Kashmir Shaivism, and I think Zen shares the same feature, is distinct from many other spiritual and religious traditions, because whereas many other traditions seek to overcome the world, to leave it behind, to deny it, or to realize it as an illusion, Kashmir Shaivism instead seeks to fully participate in the world, recognizing it as not separate from, but ultimately one with the supreme reality, Shiva. So what does any of this mean in practice? Well, for Kashmir Shaivism, as with Zen, enlightenment is a direct experiential recognition in the here and now of one's true nature. It can come gradually through ritual, meditation, yoga, or study, or it can come suddenly and spontaneously through the descent of divine grace. The practices of this tradition are evidently diverse, ranging from elaborate tantric rituals to subtle meditations on the nature of consciousness itself. But at the heart of them all is the recognition that the light of awareness is always already present. Our task is not to create, but to recognize it. And what happens when this recognition dawns? The practitioner no longer feels alienated or separate from the world. Instead, they see the world itself as their own self-expression. Mountains, rivers, peoples, joys, sorrows, all are experienced as radiating with the same consciousness that shines as I or self. I suspect that essentially Hegel, the German thinker, arrived at essentially the same view of the world. Now, this may sound quite abstract and philosophical, and I think the analogy of dreaming can help. Because, of course, in a dream, you experience a world of multiplicity, of different objects and experiences that appear very different from you. However, upon waking or awakening, you come to realize, or to use the language of Kashmir Shaivism, you come to recognize that what appeared separate and other was actually one and the same self expressing itself, experiencing itself. And so ultimately for the enlightened being, for the freed being, there is nothing to fear, because everything is recognized as one and the same consciousness, endlessly unraveling and expressing itself. This is what the Hindus refer to as Leela, or the dance of Shiva, which I referred to previously. So, to conclude, Kashmir Shaivism is not just an old philosophical system locked away in Sanskrit texts, Sanskrit of course being the language of the Hindu scriptures. It is instead a living vision of reality that invites us to re-examine what we take to be most fundamental. At a time when so many philosophies and sciences reduce consciousness to a byproduct of matter, Kashmir Shaivism turns the equation upside down. It says that consciousness is the very ground, and matter is its expression. Therefore, I'd argue that this philosophy has much to contribute to ongoing debates within Western analytic philosophy concerning the so-called hard problem of consciousness. This is the problem of explaining how inert matter can possibly give rise to subjectivity. Kashmir Shaivism, of course, avoids this whole problem by flipping it on its head. It's not that consciousness or subjectivity arises from matter, but that matter, the physical world, arises from consciousness as its very play or dance. Evidently, this is a philosophy that does not reject the world as illusion, nor deny the self as a fiction, as so many traditions do, but instead embraces life in all its diversity as the free and joyful play of divine awareness. Whether approached through ritual, meditation, or sudden spontaneous grace, its goal is always the same: to recover the recognition or recognition that our true authentic identity is none other than Shiva, universal absolute consciousness itself. Thank you for watching, and I hope that this introduction has given you a sense of the depth and profundity of the philosophy of Kashmir Shaivism. Don't forget to like and subscribe, leaving your comments below. Your support enables this channel to continue growing. I'd also be very curious to hear what you'd like me to cover in future videos. Perhaps there could be a future topic, for example, on Vedanta or on German idealism. Like I said, if you'd like to find out more about Tantra and Zen, which I've referred to during this talk, I'd encourage you to check out my videos on those subjects. Until next time.